In the heart of a city that never sleeps, a predator lurks in the shadows, turning a symbol of urban convenience into a harbinger of death. What you are about to hear is a story of a chilling series of murders that paralyzed a metropolis and baffled investigators. A case where every tick of the taxi meter could be the last moments of an innocent life. This is the tale of the Silent Night Slaughter. Before we delve into the darkness, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single detail of this bone-chilling investigation. Now, let the journey into the heart of fear begin. The rain fell in relentless, silvery sheets, washing the neon-lit streets of Viridia City into a slick, impressionistic canvas of bleeding colors. It was the kind of night that drove people indoors, a night for warm blankets and quiet contemplation. For Detective Miles Corbin of the Viridia City Police Department, however, this was the kind of night that promised trouble. He'd been a homicide detective for 15 years, and he'd developed a cynical sixth sense for when the city's darker underbelly was about to spill onto its rain-washed pavement. The insistent, shrill ring of his desk phone at 3:17 a.m. was a grim confirmation of his premonition. "Corbin," he answered, his voice a gravelly rumble, thick with the remnants of sleep and too many cups of stale coffee. The voice on the other end was that of a young, flustered patrol officer, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "Detective, we've got a 10 to 57 down on the corner of Blackwood and 12th. Taxi. This is not good, sir. You need to see this." Corbin was already shrugging on his trench coat, the familiar weight of it a strange comfort. "On my way," he grunted, slamming the phone down. Blackwood and 12th was in the industrial district, a desolate stretch of warehouses and abandoned factories that was all but deserted at this hour. Not a place you'd expect to hail a cab. The drive was a blur of slick streets and the rhythmic thud of his windshield wipers battling the downpour. As he pulled up to the scene, the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen patrol cars painted a chaotic, strobing mural on the wet brick walls of the surrounding buildings. The area was already cordoned off with yellow tape, a stark, artificial boundary against the encroaching darkness. He ducked under the tape, his polished black shoes splashing in a growing puddle. His partner, Detective Lena Petrova, was already there, her face a pale, grim mask under the harsh, intermittent glare of the emergency lights. She was younger than Corbin, sharp as a tack, with a quiet intensity that he'd come to respect. "Miles," she said, her voice low. "It's a bad one." She led him to the taxi, a standard yellow sedan, its engine cold and its hazard lights blinking in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The driver's side door was ajar, and inside, the scene was one of brutal, calculated violence. The victim, a man in his late 20s, was slumped in the back seat. He was well-dressed, in a tailored suit that was now soaked in blood. His throat had been cut with a savage, deep precision that spoke of both rage and a steady hand. His eyes were wide open, a silent, glassy testament to his final moments of terror. The taxi's meter was frozen at $12.50, a mundane detail in a scene of utter horror. Corbin took a long, slow breath, the metallic tang of blood mixing with the scent of rain and wet asphalt. He'd seen a lot in his time, but the cold, clinical nature of this murder sent a shiver down his spine. "Who found him?" "A security guard from the warehouse across the street," Petrova explained, gesturing with a gloved hand. "He was doing his rounds, saw the taxi with its hazards on. Thought it was a breakdown at first. When he got closer," she trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the gruesome tableau inside the cab. The forensic team was already at work, their flashlights cutting through the gloom as they meticulously combed the area for any scrap of evidence. Dr. Alistair Finch, the city's stoic and unflappable medical examiner, was crouched by the open door of the taxi, his expression as grim as Corbin had ever seen it. "What have you got for me, Alistair?" Corbin asked, his voice a low murmur. Finch looked up, his glasses fogged slightly from the humidity. "One victim, male, late 20s. Single, deep laceration to the throat, severing the carotid artery and the jugular vein. Death would have been almost instantaneous. Time of death, I'd estimate between 1 and 2 a.m. The rain will make it tricky to be more precise. Any signs of a struggle? Petrova inquired. Finch shook his head. Minimal. A few defensive wounds on his hands, but they're shallow. It's as if he was taken completely by surprise. Corbin's gaze swept the interior of the taxi. The front seat was empty. The driver was gone. Where's the driver? That's the million-dollar question, Petrova said, her brow furrowed in concentration. The cab is registered to a company called Viridia City Cabs. The driver assigned to this vehicle is a man named Samuel Miller. We've run his name, address, everything. Patrol cars have been dispatched to his last known address, but there's no answer. His phone is going straight to voicemail. So, we have a missing driver and a dead passenger, Corbin mused, his mind already sifting through the possibilities. A robbery gone wrong? A personal dispute? Or something far more sinister? He walked around the taxi, his eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle. The rain was a curse, washing away potential evidence with every passing second. He noticed something on the rain-slicked pavement, a few feet from the open rear door of the cab. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and shone his flashlight on the object. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb. It was stained with a dark, almost black liquid that he knew, with a sinking feeling, was blood. "Bag this," he said to one of the forensic technicians, his voice tight. Carefully, as the first, faint hints of dawn began to break through the oppressive gloom, casting a sickly, gray light over the city, the investigation was in full swing. The victim had been identified as Julian Croft, a young, successful investment banker who worked in the city's financial district. He was last seen leaving a high-end restaurant after a late dinner with clients. He'd told them he was taking a cab home. Corbin and Petrova spent the morning at Croft's upscale apartment, a sterile, minimalist space that offered few clues about the man who had lived there. They spoke to his colleagues, his friends, his distraught family. A picture began to emerge of a man who was ambitious, intelligent, and, by all accounts, had no known enemies. The search for the missing taxi driver, Samuel Miller, intensified. His apartment was a stark contrast to Croft's luxurious home. It was a small, sparsely furnished place in a rundown part of town. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that he had packed a bag or left in a hurry. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. His worried wife told the detectives that he was a good man, a hard-working man, who had never been in any trouble. Days turned into a week, and the case grew colder. The media had caught wind of the story, and the headlines were sensational and speculative. The taxi terror, one newspaper had dubbed the unknown assailant. Fear began to ripple through the city. People started to think twice before hailing a cab, especially at night. Corbin and Petrova were hitting one dead end after another. The security cameras in the area around the crime scene had been either non-existent or of such poor quality that they offered no usable footage. The wooden bird found at the scene was a unique, hand-carved piece, but its origins remained a mystery. They had interviewed dozens of people, chased down countless leads, but they were no closer to finding Samuel Miller or identifying Julian Croft's killer. Corbin found himself staring at the crime scene photos late one night. The gruesome images burned into his memory. The sterile, almost ritualistic nature of the killing bothered him. The single, precise cut, the lack of a struggle, the disappearance of the driver. It didn't feel like a random act of violence. It felt like a performance, a statement. And then, a week after the discovery of Julian Croft's body, the call came. Another taxi, another deserted street corner, another victim. This time, the scene was on the other side of the city, in a quiet, residential neighborhood. The victim was a young woman, a nurse on her way home from a late shift at the hospital. The circumstances were eerily similar to the first murder. She was in the back of the taxi, her throat cut with the same brutal precision. The meter was stopped. The driver was gone. And on the pavement, just a few feet from the open door of the cab, lay another small, blood-stained, hand-carved wooden bird. Corbin stood in the rain once more, the flashing lights of the patrol cars reflecting in his weary eyes. A cold, chilling realization washed over him. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was the work of a serial killer. And he was just getting started. The Silent Night slaughter had begun. The second murder sent a fresh wave of panic through Viridia City. The media went into a frenzy, and the police department was under immense pressure to make an arrest. A task force was formed with Corbin and Petrova at the helm. They worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a growing sense of urgency. The second victim's name was Elena Rosales. She was a dedicated nurse, beloved by her colleagues and patients. Like Julian Croft, she had no apparent enemies. She was just an ordinary person in the wrong place at the wrong time. The second taxi was also registered to Viridia City Cabs. The driver, a man named Marcus Thorne, was also missing. His family was frantic with worry. He was a father of two, a man with no criminal record and no reason to disappear. The pattern was now terrifyingly clear. The killer was targeting passengers in taxis, using the anonymity of the city's sprawling transportation network to find his victims. He was meticulous, he was organized, and he was leaving a calling card: the small, hand-carved wooden birds. Corbin and Petrova delved into the world of Viridia City's taxi drivers. They interviewed hundreds of them, trying to find any connection, any lead that might point them in the right direction. They learned about the rivalries between different taxi companies, the dangers of the job, the strange and sometimes violent encounters that drivers had with their passengers. But no one had heard of any driver-on-passenger violence on this scale. They also focused their attention on Viridia City Cabs. They scrutinized the company's hiring practices, their background checks, their vehicle maintenance records. They were looking for any anomaly, any red flag that might have been missed. The company's owner, a gruff, apathetic man named Stan, was less than helpful. He provided the records they asked for, but he seemed more concerned about the damage to his company's reputation than the lives that had been lost. The investigation into the wooden birds was also hitting a brick wall. They had consulted with experts in woodworking and folk art, but no one could identify the specific style or origin of the carvings. They were unique, and that made them all the more unsettling. As the days stretched into another week, the city remained on edge. The once bustling nightlife of Viridia City had all but died down. People were afraid to go out after dark, and the sight of a yellow taxi, once a symbol of convenience, now inspired a sense of dread. Corbin and Petrova felt the weight of the city's fear on their shoulders. They were exhausted, frustrated, and haunted by the images of the victims. They knew that the killer was still out there, watching, waiting, and planning his next move. One rainy afternoon, as they were poring over the case files in their cluttered office, Petrova had a breakthrough. She had been cross-referencing the GPS data from the two abandoned taxis, a tedious and painstaking process. "Miles, look at this," she said, her voice filled with a newfound excitement. She pointed to a map on her computer screen, which was covered in a complex web of colored lines. "This is the route of Samuel Miller's taxi on the night of Julian Croft's murder. And this," she said, highlighting another line, "is the route of Marcus Thorne's taxi on the night of Elena Rosales' murder." She zoomed in on a specific area of the map, a section of the city known for its old, abandoned industrial warehouses. Both taxis were in this area for a significant period of time before the murders took place. They weren't picking up or dropping off passengers. They were just waiting. Corbin leaned in closer, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "What's in that area?" "Nothing much," Petrova said, pulling up satellite images of the location. "Just a bunch of derelict buildings. But there's one that stands out." She pointed to a large, isolated warehouse at the edge of the district. "This one used to be a toy factory. It's been abandoned for years." Toy factory. The words hung in the air, sending a chill down Corbin's spine. The hand-carved wooden birds. It was a long shot, but it was the first real lead they had. "Let's get a warrant," Corbin said, his voice a low growl. "And let's go pay a visit to this old toy factory." As they drove towards the industrial district, the rain began to fall once more, as if the city itself was weeping for the victims of the Silent Night slaughter. Corbin had a feeling, a deep, gut-wrenching feeling that they were about to step into the heart of the killer's world. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that what they would find there would change the course of the investigation forever. The first chapter of this terrifying story was drawing to a close, but the darkest chapters were yet to come. The old toy factory loomed before them like a skeletal beast, its broken windows like hollow, vacant eyes staring out into the rain-swept dusk. The air around it was thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. A sense of foreboding hung heavy in the atmosphere, a silent warning that they were treading on unholy ground. Corbin and Petrova, along with a heavily armed SWAT team, approached the building with caution. The warrant had been easy to obtain. The judge had been as eager as they were to see a break in the case that had brought Viridia City to its knees. The main entrance was chained and padlocked, but the chain was old and rusted, and it snapped easily under the force of the SWAT team's bolt cutters. The heavy metal doors groaned in protest as they were forced open, revealing a cavernous, dark interior. Flashlights cut through the oppressive gloom, their beams dancing across mountains of decaying cardboard boxes, rusted machinery, and the ghostly, dismembered remains of old toys. The factory was a graveyard of childhood dreams, a place where joy and innocence had long since been replaced by dust and shadows. The team spread out, their movements slow and methodical. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that whistled through the broken windows, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. They were in the killer's lair, and they had no idea if he was still there, lurking in the darkness. It was Petrova who found it first. In a small, windowless room in the back of the factory, hidden behind a stack of old crates, she discovered a makeshift workshop. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the factory. It was clean, organized, and meticulously arranged. On a workbench in the center of the room, there was a set of woodworking tools, all of them polished and well cared for. And next to the tools, there was a small, half-finished wooden bird, identical in design to the ones found at the crime scenes. On the wall above the workbench, there was a large corkboard. It was covered in a collage of newspaper clippings about the murders, along with detailed maps of the city and photographs of Julian Croft and Elena Rosales. But it was what was on the other side of the room that made their blood run cold. There were 2 more corkboards, each one dedicated to a different person. On one, there were photographs of a man they recognized from the news reports as Samuel Miller, the first missing taxi driver. On the other, there were pictures of Marcus Thorne, the second missing driver. And next to their photographs, there were chilling, handwritten notes detailing their daily routines, their families, their fears. It was a stalker's shrine, a testament to the killer's obsessive and terrifyingly intimate knowledge of his victims. But there was something else in the room, something that was even more disturbing. In the corner, there was a small, soundproof chamber. The door was ajar, and as Corbin pushed it open, a wave of metallic, coppery air washed over them. Inside, the scene was one of unimaginable horror. The walls were lined with plastic sheeting, and in the center of the room, there was a single, sturdy wooden chair. The chair, and the floor around it, were stained with a dark, dried substance that they knew was blood. This was where the killer had brought his victims. This was where he had tortured them, where he had reveled in their fear and their pain. The discovery of the workshop and the torture chamber was a major breakthrough in the case. They now had a location, a place where the killer felt safe, a place where he had planned and executed his horrific crimes. But they still didn't have a name, a face, or a motive. The forensic team descended on the factory, and they spent the next 2 days meticulously combing every inch of the building for evidence. They found fingerprints, DNA samples, and a wealth of other forensic evidence that they hoped would lead them to the killer. While the forensic team worked their magic, Corbin and Petrova focused on the information they had found on the corkboards. The killer's obsessive stalking of the 2 missing taxi drivers was a new and terrifying dimension to the case. It suggested that the drivers were not just random victims of circumstance, but an integral part of the killer's twisted plan. They delved into the lives of Samuel Miller and Marcus Thorne, looking for any connection, any shared history that might explain why they had been targeted. They discovered that both men had previously worked for a different taxi company, a smaller, now defunct company called Bluebird cabs. The name sent a shiver down Corbin's spine. The wooden birds. Bluebird cabs. Couldn't be a coincidence. They dug deeper into the history of Bluebird cabs, and what they found was a story of a company that had been driven out of business by its larger, more aggressive competitor, Viridia City Cabs. The owner of Bluebird Cabs, a man named Arthur Finch, had lost everything. He had been forced to declare bankruptcy, and he had publicly blamed Viridia City Cabs for his downfall. They ran a background check on Arthur Finch, and what they found was a man with a history of mental instability and a deep-seated grudge against the world. He had been in and out of psychiatric institutions for years, and he had a documented history of violent outbursts. And then they found the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. Arthur Finch's late wife had been an artist, a sculptor who had specialized in creating intricate, hand-carved wooden birds. They had their man. The task force descended on Arthur Finch's last known address, a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city. They found the house empty, but the signs of his recent presence were everywhere. There were more wooden birds, more newspaper clippings about the murders, and a detailed, handwritten manifesto in which he laid out his twisted and vengeful plan. In the manifesto, he wrote about his hatred for Viridia City Cabs, the company that had destroyed his life. He wrote about his desire for revenge, his plan to systematically dismantle the company's reputation and sow fear and chaos throughout the city. He had targeted the passengers because they were the lifeblood of the taxi industry. He had targeted the drivers from his old company because he saw them as traitors, men who had abandoned him in his time of need. He had spared their lives, but he had taken everything else from them, forcing them to participate in his gruesome acts of violence. The manifesto also revealed the horrifying fate of Samuel Miller and Marcus Thorne. Finch had kidnapped them, held them captive in his soundproof chamber, and forced them to watch as he murdered his victims. He had then released them, their minds shattered by the trauma they had endured, and had warned them that if they ever went to the police, he would hunt them down and kill their families. The search for Arthur Finch became a citywide manhunt. His face was plastered on every news channel, on every newspaper, on every street corner. The city held its breath, waiting for the monster who had terrorized them for weeks to be brought to justice. Corbin and Petrova knew that Finch was a cornered animal, and that he was capable of anything. They also knew that he had two more potential victims in his sights. In his manifesto, he had mentioned two other former Bluebird Cabs drivers, two more traitors, who were now working for Viridia City Cabs. The race was on to find those two drivers before Finch did. The task force worked frantically trying to track down the two men. They finally located one of them, a man named David Chun, who had been so terrified by the news of the murders that he had gone into hiding. The second driver, a man named Robert Jenkins, was not so lucky. By the time the police found him, it was too late. He was in his taxi, in a deserted alleyway, and the scene was a grim and bloody echo of the previous murders. He was in the back seat, his throat cut, and on the pavement beside the car, there was another small, blood-stained wooden bird. The murder of Robert Jenkins was a brazen act of defiance, a message from Finch to the police and to the city. He was not going to be stopped. He was not going to be caught. But Finch had made a mistake. In his haste to make a statement, he had become careless. A witness, a homeless man who had been sleeping in the alley, had seen the killer's face. The police now had a positive identification, and they had a lead on Finch's whereabouts. The witness had seen him get into a beat-up old van and drive away. The entire police force of Viridia City was now on the hunt for the van. They set up roadblocks, they scoured the city's security camera footage, and they chased down every lead, no matter how small. Corbin and Petrova were in the command center, coordinating the search. The tension in the room was palpable. They were close, so close, to catching the man who had brought so much death and fear to their city. And then, they got the break they had been waiting for. A patrol car had spotted the van, parked outside an old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of the city. The amusement park was a place of faded memories and decaying grandeur. The rides were rusted and silent. The once bright colors of the stalls and attractions had been bleached by the sun and the rain. It was a place where laughter had once echoed, But now it was a place of silence and shadows. It was the perfect place for a final, dramatic showdown. As the SWAT team surrounded the amusement park, Corbin and Petrova prepared to go in. They knew that Finch was armed and dangerous, and that he would not be taken alive. The rain began to fall once more, a fitting soundtrack to the final act of this grim and bloody tragedy. As they entered the park, the rusted gates groaning in protest, they knew that they were about to confront the ghost in the machine, the man who had turned the simple act of taking a taxi into a dance with death. The second chapter of the Silent Night slaughter was over, but the final, bloody confrontation was about to begin. The abandoned amusement park was a labyrinth of shadows and distorted shapes. The skeletal remains of roller coasters and Ferris wheels reached up to the stormy sky like the grasping fingers of long-dead giants. The rain fell in a steady, mournful drizzle, turning the dusty paths into muddy streams and drumming a somber, relentless rhythm on the rusted tin roofs of the deserted game stalls. Corbin and Petrova moved through this surreal, decaying landscape with a practiced, silent efficiency. The SWAT team had established a perimeter, and now it was up to the two of them to corner their prey. They knew that Finch was in here somewhere, watching, waiting. The park was his chosen battleground, and he had all the advantages. He knew the layout, the hiding places, the dark corners where a man could disappear and reappear like a phantom. They split up, a decision born of necessity rather than wisdom. They had to cover more ground, and they had to do it quickly. They maintained radio contact, their whispered communications a stark contrast to the vast, eerie silence of the park. Corbin made his way towards the House of Mirrors, its once gleaming facade now cracked and grimy. He had a hunch that Finch, a man so obsessed with his own distorted view of reality, would be drawn to a place like this. He pushed open the creaking doors and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The mirrors, though tarnished and stained with age, still held their power. His reflection multiplied into 1,000 different versions of himself, 1,000 weary, determined detectives staring back at him from every angle. He moved cautiously, his hand on the butt of his gun. The silence in the House of Mirrors was a living, breathing thing. It was a silence that was filled with unseen presences and unspoken threats. Every step he took echoed in the vast, confusing space, and he had the unsettling feeling that he was not alone. And then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A footstep on a creaky floorboard. "Finch," Corbin called out, his voice steady and calm. "It's over. There's nowhere to run." His only answer was the sound of his own voice, bouncing off the mirrored walls and coming back at him from a dozen different directions. He continued to move forward, deeper into the maze of reflections. He saw a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors, a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure. He spun around, his gun raised, but there was nothing there. He was playing Finch's game, and Finch was a master of manipulation and deceit. Meanwhile, Petrova was making her way through the part of the park that had once been a whimsical, fairy tale-themed land. The grinning faces of the plaster gnomes and fairies that lined the path were now chipped and faded, their once joyful expressions twisted into grotesque, leering masks. She was a profiler by training, and she was trying to get inside Finch's head. He was a man who had lost everything, a man who saw himself as a victim, a tragic figure in a world that had wronged him. He would be drawn to a place that reflected his own sense of faded glory and lost innocence. She stopped in front of a small, dilapidated puppet theater. The stage was empty, the velvet curtains torn and faded. It was a place where stories had once been told, where heroes and villains had once battled for the hearts and minds of children. She had a feeling that Finch was close. She stepped onto the stage, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She saw something on the floor, a small, dark object. She knelt and picked it up. It was a wooden bird, identical to the ones that Finch had left at the crime scenes. And then she heard a voice from the shadows behind her. "You're a clever one, detective," the voice said. It was a soft, almost gentle voice, a voice that was utterly at odds with the horrific acts that the man had committed. Petrova turned slowly, her hand on her weapon. Arthur Finch was standing in the wings of the stage, a tall, gaunt figure with wild, haunted eyes. He was holding a large, sharp-looking carving knife in his hand. "It's over, Arthur," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "Put the knife down." Finch smiled, a sad, broken smile. "Over? No, detective. It's not over. Not until everyone understands. Not until everyone sees what they did to me." He began to walk towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. "They took everything from me," he said, his voice filled with a chilling, self-pitying rage. "My company, my home, my wife. She was an artist, you know. She made beautiful things. She made birds." He held up the knife, and the dim light from Petrova's flashlight glinted on its polished steel blade. "And now," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I make birds too, but my birds, they sing a different song. A song of pain and fear and justice." He lunged at her, the knife flashing in the darkness. Petrova was ready. She sidestepped his attack and brought the butt of her gun down hard on his wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. Finch cried out in pain, but he was not done yet. He was fueled by a desperate, fanatical rage, and he threw himself at her, his hands reaching for her throat. They struggled in the darkness, a desperate, violent dance on the forgotten stage of the puppet theater. Petrova was strong, but Finch was wiry and surprisingly powerful. He was fighting for his life, for his twisted vision of justice, and he was not going to give up without a fight. Corbin, hearing the sounds of the struggle over his radio, came running. He burst into the puppet theater just in time to see Finch on top of Petrova, his hands wrapped around her neck. "Get off her!" Corbin roared, and he fired a single shot. The bullet hit Finch in the shoulder, and he staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He looked down at the blood that was starting to soak through his shirt, and then he looked up at Corbin, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You don't understand," he whispered, and then he collapsed to the floor. The reign of the Silent Night slaughter was over. The aftermath of Arthur Finch's capture was a media sensation. The city of Viridia, which had been living in a state of fear for weeks, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The newspapers that had once been filled with headlines of terror and death were now filled with stories of heroism and justice. Corbin and Petrova were hailed as heroes, but they did not feel like heroes. They were just two dedicated cops who had done their job. They were haunted by the faces of the victims, by the senseless violence that had been unleashed upon their city. The two missing taxi drivers, Samuel Miller and Marcus Thorne, were found alive, but they were broken men. The psychological scars of their ordeal would never fully heal. They were a living testament to the true cost of Arthur Finch's twisted quest for revenge. Finch survived his gunshot wound, and he was put on trial for his crimes. The trial was a long and arduous process, and the details of his horrific acts shocked and disgusted the nation. He was found guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. Life in Viridia City slowly returned to normal. People started hailing taxis again. The nightlife returned to its former vibrancy, and the fear that had gripped the city began to fade into a dark and distant memory. But for Corbin and Petrova, the memory would never fade. They would always carry the weight of the Silent Night slaughter with them. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back at them. One rainy evening, a few months after the trial, Corbin and Petrova were sitting in a quiet, dimly lit bar, sharing a drink. The rain was falling outside, just as it had on the night when the first body was found. "Do you ever think about him?" Petrova asked, her voice a low murmur. Corbin knew who she was talking about. He took a long sip of his whiskey. "Every day," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think about the victims. I think about their families. And I think about the fact that there are more like him out there. Men who are just one bad day away from becoming monsters." He looked at Petrova, and he saw the same weariness, the same sadness that he felt in his own soul. They were two soldiers who had fought a long and bloody war, and they had come out of it scarred, but not broken. "But we'll be there to stop them," Petrova said, her voice filled with a quiet, steely resolve. That's what we do. Corbin nodded, and a faint smile touched his lips. Yeah, he said. That's what we do. They clinked their glasses together, a silent toast to the victims they had avenged, to the city they had protected, and to the darkness that they would always be there to fight. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Viridia City clean, but they knew that the scars of the silent night slaughter would always remain, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk in the human heart.